Hey everyone, welcome back to the People's Perspective on Development with your host, myself, Tanisha Kassim. Today, as you know, we're going to be unpacking discussions, which is actually a continuation of episode 5 with Prof. Karina Landman. So excited to continue the discussions. Right now, we're going to be continuing the discussion on public open space, and I cannot wait to get into it with you guys. Here we go.
This area. This is a sort of a contrast to the one we just discussed. Now, this is more of like, how do we look at public open space? And I came across this example. I also had a discussion with one of your fellow students, Bayitsi, who also worked with you, and we also share, that same passion for how does public space work? And his side was public open space, and we discussed a few examples. And we even considered this idea of how do we use educational facilities that, are supposed to be for public, but now privatized, and then we have these fences up. And this was a great, contrast of what how we think parks can be used, I think. So just your thoughts on, parks and how do we look at open space no longer as areas of unsafety or unsafe spaces and areas that we often neglect alongside our homes. A lot of the times people don't even want them anymore because of gangs related. Just recently we had a work colleague of mine who was robbed driving into our house because they've got a park across the street. How do you see this in terms of improving the perceptions we have of public open space?
I think again, if we go from where we left off, it's critical that we do have these spaces when we have more and more people together. If we look at a sustainability point of view, when we start looking at ecological services and access to ecological services in the city, I think open space becomes more and more important because people need access to various type of ecosystem services where they can, whether it's, access just to plants, whether it's simple things like you need to breathe, whether it's things like the cultural value, whether it's things like educational value, often if you grow up in this tower blocks, you don't even know, how does the process work? You've got a seed, you put it in, you give it water. After a few weeks, you get a little seedling, then it becomes bigger, then it grows. So it's got a huge educational value. So I think there are a number of things when you look at the safety of parks. One, and they said that long ago when Jane Jacobs and a lot of other people were looking at what they call crime prevention through environmental design, some of the critical things are that there's safety in numbers. You have to have people there, people that you can trust, but you also need buildings surrounding those spaces that overlook those spaces so that they can see what's happening there. And another critical factor is the activities. So if you want to make a space safe and well used so that you will also have those other things, you need to have activities that will attract people. So there's a lot of things. Obviously, mixed use become important, but then also things like how do we work together with nature? Urban agriculture, I think, is critical. If you look at the food security that all the challenges that we are having regarding food security.
Yes.
So if you have a big area like that, again, I don't know the space, but you could easily start having small little community gardens or educational centers where people can learn about planting, or where children can go and actually have a little patch where they can plant something. You can also then use this for other types of services in the city. I mean, you talked about infiltration ponds, you talked about how do you work with wastewater, how do you work with wetlands in cities, how do you work with rivers, how do you start seeing the city as different systems that can work together instead of working against each other? I think that's a big problem that we often faced with in planning is you've got the people that only look at this, and then you've got the engineers that only look at the roads, and then you've got the planners that only look at the land use, and they don't really, and the environmentalists look at the bees and the flowers and the whatever. Sorry, I'm simplifying, but anyway, but we really need this kind of more integrated approach where we bring together the different understandings. The other day I had a professor from ecology, from geography, but working with ecology, coming, and he wanted to talk about his book, and we started talking, and he said, I should have talked to you long ago. I said, yeah, but why don't you? And I mean, at the end of the meeting, he actually gave the book to me, and I promised that I'll show it to my students and so on. But it was so lovely to get that common ground and and realize that from completely different disciplines, we actually are aiming towards the same thing.
100%.
So I think that's really, if you want to know what. Yes, so your question was really how important they are. They are extremely important, because we cannot address sustainability, the SDGs, all those lovely, wonderful goals, if we don't start thinking about how do we work with the biophysical environment. And the biophysical environment is really the ecology and the buildings and everything that we see there, and how do we start thinking about them as an integrated system with the way that people think and interact and so on. So in sustainable development theory, some of the new thinking talks about seeing cities as socio-ecological systems, and I think that's really, really critical, and public space plays a critical role in that approach of working with the city as a socio-ecological system.
I think there is a great point that you touched on, is just like, how do we look at the city nowadays? You know, I think before we just saw it as this machine that needs to have, you know, public transport, business, jobs, work, and housing. But now we're actually like learning that you have to sort of redefine how you look at the city. It's always changing, and our planning system should be able to adapt to how it's changing and what it needs for not only our survival, but also its own survival. Because, you know, now we're experiencing so many challenges with climate, land issues, and space. So we can't exactly, you know, sort of just impose our needs without considering where does the city fit in as well.
Absolutely.
This touches back on public spaces in South Africa. And what was really interesting when we looked at public space in South Africa is that, and you've touched on it previously when we began, is that public space was almost weaponized during you know, apartheid time. Is that, you know, that was very specifically for a certain, you know, individual, and access to these areas were very limited, and, you know, and forcefully removed people who did not belong. And I think that, you know, how do we change that perception again about public space being for everyone? And I think that's where my interest in location comes into play. I have two examples here. One is North Park in Johannesburg, and then the other one is Sea Point. And you look at the difference between investment that's taking place. One area is very clean. It's, you know, there's a sense of beautification and aesthetic, whereas, you know, the other space is almost just an open space that looks like it, you know, these kids started using it. And, you know, the question about, you know, South African public spaces is, how do we begin making it welcoming for people without putting a price tag to it in the urban spaces?
There's not a quick fix-all solution. Sorry to say that. The more I work in this area, the more I realize that it's incredibly contextual. So don't ask me to write a little recipe for this is what's going to make a public space successful. It doesn't work like that. We're busy with a big NRF project at the moment, looking at that, and we've come to realize that you actually have to go to each community, and they're all so different, and what they understand each one of them as so-called public space is very, very different. So I talked about settlement types, for example, in the South African city. So if you work with a group in an inner city area, or you work with a group in a very traditional suburban area, or in a growing nodal area that's linked to a lot of big institutions, or a township, or informal settlement, that's so interesting. It's so different.
Very unique.
So there are certain things, they all need a place to gather. So first of all, you don't call it a public space. You say, what do you need in your particular area? And then they will tell you, we need a place where there can maybe be a health center, or a restaurant, or a tuck shop, or a church. That amazes me in South Africa. The church is very, very prominent. Or amenities, or, you know, like Sea Point is all about the fresh air and the sea and getting out. And again, it's high density, so you need that. The same with the N Street, the N Street North Park. It's the same thing, very high density, so you need that more and more. So you have to find out from that particular group what is it that they need, and then from there on, working with them in that process to build that up and to get the resources, because there's this big idea, and this links very much to sustainability and a different view of sustainability. Sustainability is not going back to where we were. Sustainability is, how do you make sure something will keep on working in a particular area for the people that's there. So if you look at public space from that point of view, then it's really, how do you involve the people? Because once the so-called professionals that think they know the best leave, once the project has been implemented, then it's going to be those people that are left there, and they must make it work. I mean, I worked in a project in Mamelodi. It was called urban upgrading through, safety promotion through urban upgrading project. It's very similar to what they did in Khayelitsha. You might have heard about the VPUU anyway. And there was a public space that we worked on. And 2 years prior to when we got there, the municipality invested an enormous amount of money in that area. And 2 years later, when we got there with the project team and everything, there was nothing left of that place, very, very little left. And then that just showed that if you don't bring people on board, and that's not easy, it can be very difficult, but we're starting to develop a lot of different ways and methods, and that's part of the project to help that process and to make it ongoing. If you don't make sure that's in place, then it's not going to work in a place like South Africa. And also establish that common vision of, I mean, we talked about needs, but needs can be completely different in different areas. For some people, gathering means this. For other people, gathering means that. You also sit with a lot of different groups. You see, you have youth groups, you have elderly people, you've got children, and often they don't need the same thing. And they irritate each other if they're in each other's spaces. So again, that's where the design comes in. How do you make sure that there's something that can work for different groups in particular areas, and also work from a point of view that it works with nature? So if you start looking at vegetation, that's where the landscape architects comes in. But if you start working with, if you start working with those kind of things, also what is important there, we don't always have to go and mimic spaces in Singapore and in Europe and everywhere. We can learn from the principles. What is it that makes that space work well? But there will be other things that's necessary in our South African context. In some areas, it might be you need some shelters there for homeless people. In some areas, it might be you need stalls for informal traders. In some areas, it might mean that you need places where the churches can come together on a Sunday, or where you can start have different different activities happening. I mean, you worked with Kondani before, but she published a very interesting article from a PhD last year where she showed that how do areas transform in South Africa, and how does that influence the public spaces? So, for example, in certain neighborhoods, you might have had people only playing tennis and cricket, and now suddenly they're playing soccer there, and the residents don't like that. Or in another area, the area was never designed for sports, but now they're playing soccer there. And now council is saying, what the heck? We never said this, you should play soccer there, but that's the need. So, I mean, it's really interesting how something like sports, for example, can start to redefine an area. So it comes back to that issue of activities. And from a planning, a regulation point of view and a planning point of view, how do we reconsider what can and should take place in a public space? So I think if we step back and we look at that, then we can go further, and it can help to address some of the challenges.
Function. It's very interesting you touched on the sporting aspect. Bahiti also mentioned it in our discussion, is that as kids, and that was the importance of the childhood question, is that even for him as a kid, when he saw vacant space, or at that time some empty grass, that was play area for him and his friends, being kids. And that was how they interacted and perceived the space, whether it was demarcated for whatever it was, even if it was an up and coming development that has not, started. That is what the user, experienced and saw and said, what, I'm going to go and play. And that's already at a childhood level. Same thing with yourself, is that, you got lost in these beautiful or spaces as a kid because you interpreted it as your area, your playground. And even though it was maybe, zoned for something else or intended for something else, the user has a different idea about it and what they want to do with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey everyone,
guys,
sorry
let's
to
take
cut
a
you
breather,
short,
take
but I
a
think
break,
we need a
take a
moment
moment,
to take a breather, and
I know that
we've had some
marinate.
informative
As
discussions.
we had
Prof. Karina
incredible
Landman has been
discussion with Prof. Karina
extremely
Landman
informative,
on
knowledgeable,
South African
and we
context of
understand why
public
she
space
is a
and public
professional
life.
in
Like
the
us to take a
industry
moment
for
to
understanding
understand
public space,
how do
understanding how
we
it functions.
evolve
What's very
as
key
planners,
here
as
is
people
firstly
in
the
development,
ideas and the
as
ideologies behind
professionals who design
how is
public
public
space
space
for
seen,
people.
how it is
How do we
used, and how
evolve and
it
adapt
functions
public
in
space
relation
to the
to the
needs of South
surroundings and the
Africans?
community it serves.
We went through a
For
few
now, I'm
case
going to
studies
take a
that
break,
unpacked
take a
and
breather,
discussed
take
the
time out
challenges around
to
safety,
marinate
the
on this
challenges
amazing
around
conversation.
hygiene,
We will come back with the
the element
continuation
of
of
being
episode
invisible in
5
public spaces,
to wrap up
and
the
also
discussion
how
and
public space was
unpack
once
further case
weaponized
studies
in the South
relating
African
to
context.
South
And I
African
think
context.
Prof.
And we're
Karina
going to take some
Landman
questions
added
from you
very
guys
valuable
and hear from
points
the
on
people. But for now,
how do
it's
we
goodbye, it's
label
good night, it's
what public
farewell.
space is to
From
South
the people's
Africans.
perspective on development,
More than
I'm
that,
your host,
as the
Tunisia.
communities have evolved, has
Hey
our
guys,
public
let's take a
spaces
breather, take a
evolved
break, take
for
a
their
moment.
vision? Do
I
we
know
share a
that we've
common
had some
vision in the
informative
professional
discussions.
practice as the
Prof. Karina
community
Landman has been
needs different
extremely
spaces?
informative,
And do these
knowledgeable,
spaces
and we
for the
understand why she
public
is a
adapt to the visions of
professional
what the
in the
public
industry
have
for
for them?
understanding public space,
I'm going to leave you with
understanding
that
how it
thought. I'm going to
functions.
leave you
What's
in
very
a moment
key
of
here
reflection
is firstly
as
the ideas
we
and the
reconvene in
ideologies
the next
behind
episode and
how is
continuation.
public
And the
space
last
seen,
segment of
how it
episode
is
5, let's
used,
hear
and
from
how
an
it
academic.
functions
In the next
in
episode, we're going to
relation
be
to the
having
surroundings and the community it
input
serves.
from you.
For now, I'm going to
So
take
stay
a break,
tuned,
take a
leave your
breather,
comments.
take time
Love
out
to hear from
to
you. But for
marinate
now,
on this
it is
amazing
good night, it is
conversation. We will come
farewell,
back with the
and
continuation of
goodbye.
episode 5
From your host
to wrap
and
up the
the people's
discussion
perspective on
and
development.
unpack further case
We bid
studies
you
relating
farewell.
to South African
Until
context.
next
And we're
time,
going to
though.
take some questions from you guys